Hi everyone, it's Dina. So I'm going to record part of chapter 19 with alterations in hormone regulation. Sorry that I'm not at home for you to hear from the dog, but the reason I wanted to record this first part, one, I'm a little bit behind, as you already know, but two, this is the part of hormone regulation alteration concepts that we don't run across as often, so I don't want to talk about them in class. Instead, I'd rather talk about a little bit more about diabetes and thyroid and maybe the adrenal glands today as well. So this is in addition to the lecture that you'll get this afternoon, which by the time you know about this, you had already had that lecture. So I'm going to talk about some alterations in hormone regulation that are a little bit more unique. And so bear with me on that. All right, so the first three slides in this presentation, are just a background, just to remind you of the major endocrine glands. Obviously, we're talking about the endocrine system. So just a quick summary of the hormones and the axons. These are just to keep your framework going, so you have a quick reference to things that you should have learned in A and P. So yeah, let's take a look at some things in general that I think will be helpful. So this is kind of important. So a lot of times when there's an endocrine issue, there's an elevation or depression of hormone levels. And it could be for various reasons, but for two things that I would like to speak at today is often there's an autoimmune issue or a tumor issue. If it's autoimmune, the gland tends to not be able to produce what it should. If it's a tumor or an associated tumor somewhere else, there are some cases where that happens. But anyway, I'll get to that in a minute. Whenever there's sort of a tumor involved, like with the pituitary gland or the adrenal glands, usually that's an oversecretion. That's a ballpark thing. So try to keep in your mind a lot of the times that glands are underproducing, it's autoimmune. When they're overproducing, it's often the sign of a tumor. But it could be any failure of a feedback mechanism with other chemical signaling features or dysfunction of the gland itself. It can be damaged. Cancer is a little different than the exact kind of tumors that I was talking about, but it still could affect both. Cancer can kind of affect negatively either way, things like the thyroid gland. But that's kind of a big picture there, right there. So you could have also a problem with moving hormones around in the blood, transport protein issues, or sensitivity issues like we've been talking about with insulin. Or the big one that we haven't ever talked about much is when there's other enzymes involved that are supposed to activate or degrade hormones and they're missing or malfunctioning. That's just a chemical mechanism that's off. And so you have left either a hormone not getting made or not getting degraded. And it's kind of important. If it doesn't get degraded, it might hang around and have more action than we want. Target cell failure. You should all know by now that we've talked a lot about the cell and it has receptors on it, and there's a lot of activity at that point and a lot of chemical signaling. So you could have a failure in the target cell where, whoops, there should be another slide here. Sorry, I went too fast. So you could have receptors that are decreasing in number. They're lowering their receptor availabilities, or their receptors are not functional. Of course, proteins or bad proteins. You could also have antibodies that are attacking or attaching to those or against those specific receptors. You have antibodies that sort of mimic some hormone action, unusual expression of receptor function. Insulin is a bit of an example there. But anyway, those are just some ways that the cell surface receptor could be modified. And most of them talking about water-soluble things here. Another water-soluble disorder is, if you remember from A&P, a hormone that is more lipid-oriented can get into a cell very easily because it is lipid soluble and the cell membrane is made of a lipid. So a lipid can get into the cell really easily. Water-soluble hormones will bind to the outside and like insulin and trigger that cascading signal transduction process inside. There can be a mechanism disruption inside the cell. That's what that's getting at. Those are both associated with water-soluble hormones and their receptors. We could also have other inhibitors, antibodies in blood coagulation, other, like I said earlier, antibodies that are interfering with target cell function. So you can have an issue with the gland or the cell that the hormone is supposed to be acting upon. Now you'll notice in this, sorry, my face is in the way. In the case of lipid hormones, they're not as recognized as target cell failure or their mechanisms because they, although they have transport issues, they can get in the cell pretty easily. And so they can get in by diffusion because they're lipid soluble. They do not transport as well, though. They are not water soluble, so that therefore they don't travel well in the bloodstream without the carrier protein that's carrying them along to help them get move in the blood. But once they get to their destination, they're pretty effective. Excuse me. All right, moving on. All right, so let's look at some bigger picture things here with your glands. So if you remember, the nervous system sends out neurotransmitters and other stimulus and muscle impulses, or I'm sorry, electrical impulses, and can have action that way. It can be very quick. There's the endocrine system works a little bit slower, although some parts of it are still very quick comparatively. But anyway, the hypothalamus is sort of like a boss, so to speak. It's going to direct the traffic between the endocrine system and the nervous system. It's kind of the link. And its main working person or gland is the pituitary gland. That's what we have learned in A&P is the master gland. And the hypothalamus is part of the brain, so it's a pituitary, but their hypothalamus functions also as an endocrine function where it releases hormones, both inhibiting and exciting hormones that will elicit a response. And so does the pituitary. And any minor alterations in those can result in problems. But the more common problem is with the pituitary or the pituitary stalk. And so there's a disconnection basically between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And if you didn't have your hypothalamus telling your pituitary to tell other things what to do, you wouldn't have the ability to menstruate women. There's a hormone that's released from your hypothalamus, the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it goes to the pituitary gland and tells the pituitary gland to release follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone, which will then, if it's FSH, it'll stimulate the ovary to produce estrogen, and the LH stimulates the ovary to produce progesterone, and you get a menstruation cycle. So if you don't have those going on, all of that's not to say, remember that about gonadotropin releasing hormone. Just remember that often it starts in the hypothalamus, which will tell the pituitary what to do. The pituitary will send signals to the glands. So when you get to the individual gland, like the thyroid gland, and there's an issue with that gland, that's called primary. Secondary is when it's more upstream of the gland. All right, so let's look at the posterior pituitary. And if you remember from A&P, the pituitary gland sort of sets off the hypothalamus. It looks like a little, quite frankly, it looks like a little nutsack, and it has a front part and a back part. The back part only really releases two hormones. The one we'll talk about today is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. The other is oxytocin, which I'm not going to talk about today, but the rest of them that are pituitary related, like the stimulating ones, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, those are on the anterior side of the pituitary. But anyway, if you have a disease of the posterior pituitary where you're not, you have what's called the syndrome of inappropriate, I love that, antidiuretic hormone secretion. You have too much, and it's called SIADH. I don't know what they call that, like SIAD or anything, but I just say inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. So it's too much ADH. And if you remember, the function of antidiuretic hormone is to oppose diuretic, so it's going to retain water and constrict blood vessels. Now here's the interesting part. You can have too much ADH because of an ectopic production of ADH by tumors somewhere else. They can make it. So that's kind of the weird thing about it. It might not necessarily be a pituitary disease, but ectopic, obviously, you know of ectopic pregnancies, things like that. It's somewhere else. And so if you get a tumor somewhere else that actually is making ADH, it can cause problems. But the clinical manifestations are basically related to water retention and reabsorption issues from the kidneys. So it could lead to hyponatremia and hypoosmolality. for some reason, it's hyponatremia may also occur after surgery. So anyway, no, we're not talking right now too much about water balance and electrolytes, but keep that in mind because we will revisit this. But just remember that too much is not good, and it could lead to hyponatremia, too much, okay? And the natremias are both about water issues more than sodium issues, although sodium obviously is involved, and it is kind of complex for right now. So basically, because in some cases you could have too high of sodium with either too much water and too little water. So it just bear with me for a bit. We'll table that for now. But anyway, so if you have a posterior pituitary problem, you could have too much ADH, and so you're too much water retention, basically. All right. Whoops. You probably can't see that. The syndrome of this would result if you have the associated hyponatremia. You're going to have thirst and concentrated urine, impaired taste, maybe some peripheral edema, maybe some weight gain from water retention, confusion, lethargy, muscle twitching. You got to correct the underlying problem that might, this is kind of with hyponatremia. If you're treating hyponatremia, you would add, it's relative to the person, but you would want to add a hypertonic saline solution. Okay, so you're probably something, I think 3%, but I'm not sure what it actually is. But anyway, the treatment for, if there's something where there's a tumor, then it would be a different story. That's treating the underlying problem. But if you're treating the hyponatremia, you need to add some salt because you're low at this point, and it's going to be relative to the patient a little bit, but mostly it's going to be something higher than the normal body salinity. All right, you could also have at the posterior pituitary, you could have what's called diabetes insipidus, where you have insufficiency of antidiuretic hormone. There's not enough water retained. Water is not retained, and it's being sent out to the kidneys. So you're going to have thirst and urination, and the concentration of your urine is not going to be very concentrated. And there's several causes. You could have a neurogenic cause where there's some injury to the head, where you have insufficient amounts or low amounts of ADH. You could also have it from the kidneys, from your nephrons, or nephrogenic inadequate response in the tubules to ADH. There's also, I didn't get into these much, psychogenic and gestational causes of this as well, but it's going to be the opposite. You're going to have enhanced water excretion, hypernatremia, and hyperosmolality. Symptoms are frequent urine, not concentrated. Hang on a second. Sorry about that, I got distracted. So back to diabetes insipidus. You're going to, of course, try to correct the underlying problem, but if you're treating the hypernatremia, you're going to want to replace lost fluids, and maybe it just kind of depends. This one, treating hypernatremia is tricky because you got to figure out what's causing it, even itself, with water balance and sodium, because you could have two, if water's moving out of your blood versus, if sodium concentration is higher in your blood, but your cells are not, and where's water being lost, and blah, blah, blah. It's all a very complicated formula that we will talk about. But for now, just remember that you could actually cause problems in the other place where you push too many electrolytes or a saline solution, but you don't want to do that here. You obviously don't want to add salines to this. You want to do something that's lower in osmolality with respect to the patient's serum. So a lot of times it's just replace fluid loss, depending on, maybe if it was from dehydration and sweating or something, then you would do it a little bit, just replace water fluid, but you also might need to add dextrose or water with IV fluid. All right. Oh, sorry. Moving on. So anterior pituitary problems, the one that is kind of weird. There's a lot of problems that can result from any of those hormones that are interrupted. So these would be a lot of the stimulating ones, the ACTH, TSH, FSH, LH, prolactin. So there's some other ones, probably about 5 or 6 hormones of the pituitary gland. But anyway, if you have a low functioning pituitary gland, you have diminished hormone secretion. This could cause a lot of things actually, but specifically dwarfism in children and some problems with adults as well if you don't have growth hormone. Let's see, the pituitary could get damaged pretty easily. It's highly vascular, so infections, trauma, infarctions, all of those things can lead to problems with the pituitary, of course, including tumors. So hang on to that thought for a minute, but opposite of that is hyperpituitarism. Like I said, a lot of times the hypers are caused by benign, slow-growing tumors. So that's a little different than some other type of tumors as well. It just sort of depends on the nature of the cancer, but usually they're kind of benign, slow-growing pituitary tumors. It's kind of interesting because I think they can kind of do surgery kind of through your nasal passage. Kind of sets close to your nasal passage if you go in there, but I'm not 100% sure if I remember that correctly, but it could manifest itself in hypersecretion of a lot of interior pituitary hormones, headaches and fatigues, and other such things. But let's look at this hypersecretion a little bit. So here we were talking about low, so small children and premature aging in adults. But when we go to the hyper side, there's a lot of things that we can look at. So hang on a second. I get some interruptions here. All right, resuming our talk. So prolactin is a hormone that's produced by the anterior pituitary. And if it's too much, or if it's an area that's affected by a tumor, you're going to get, in women, irregularity in menstruation and breast milk. Unfortunately for both men and women, decreased libido. For men, also reduced libido, like I said, and reduced testosterone. And I should have had reduced there, but it would be lower testosterone and enlarged breast. Prolactin, as you know, is involved in lactation, and so that makes sense why you would be seeing these things. All right, if you have a overstimulation of the thyroid from the pituitary sending too much TSH because the pituitary's got a problem, it's not necessarily not the traditional hypothyroid. You're going to get an overproduction of this, and you're going to get excess thyroid function because your body can make it. In hypothyroid, you get that extra, you get a lot of TSH that's coming from the pituitary, but it's coming because it's not getting a feedback. In this case, it's just sending it because it's got a tumor, and so it's making more of the thyroid hormone, and you get hyperthyroid symptoms. Same with the adrenal glands. Overstimulation will cause ACTH to have excess, and it's too much cortisol, and you have a syndrome called Cushing syndrome that we'll talk about in a little bit later. But I'll do that today in class. And if you have too much growth hormone, so now you have too much growth hormone, you get different things in children. Acromegaly in adults is what it's called. It's sort of weird bone formations in largeness, and it's gigantism in children. If it occurs, if the growth hormone is given in excess as a young kid, it's going to lead to a different condition than if when you're an adult, you suddenly start to have more growth hormone. And you can kind of see a picture of that here coming up. So acromegaly in adults usually happens around 40 to 59, and you can see the person gets some, it's caused by too much growth hormone during adulthood, and from the pituitary tumor, it's the most common cause, and you can see pronounced cheekbones and forehead bulges and that sort of thing. Gigantism on the other side is when you get the hypersecretion of growth hormone in children or adolescents. Here are some diseases of the interior. This is somebody that's got gigantism, and this is probably somebody with too little. There's other ways of dwarfism and things, but pituitary is it has the main function of it is secreting growth hormone. One of the main functions, sorry. In fact, my niece, I have a lot of them, but the one that I don't talk about as much, this one is in her 30s. She has a benign pituitary tumor, and it's kept her very small as a as an adult. And, you know, so she looks, she's mature. She has secondary sex characteristics and all that, but she's very tiny in size. All right, that's it.